Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. We'll start shortly. So we just finished the two concurrently running 6-day intensives. So I'd like to thank everyone that joined that. It was a great initiation of that intensive series that has started. So this is essentially the 13th satsang in the last 6 days. And I started the first intensive satsang talking about the core, essentially, of the teaching, which is a little differently explained to how it's normally described. And then on the last satsang, we ended with essentially a return to that same message. It seemed fitting to end the satsang, wrapping it up in the same way it was started, or end the satsang series. So the teaching framework, as it sort of has evolved, and how I am putting it forward, is heavily inspired, largely inspired by the teaching that Ramesh was an instrument for. A teaching, we can say, was developed by Ramesh, but when we understand the principle of non-doership, we also have to understand that it was a happening. And it's interesting as to how it came about. Ramesh often told the story to illustrate how seeking starts, and to illustrate this very important point that is the basis of the understanding. Having visited gurus and teachers for many years in his life, having been a seeker all his life, growing up in a Hindu family, at the age of 60, when Ramesh retired from his role in the corporate world, he decided that he would approach spiritual seeking full-time. And given that he hadn't had the success that propelled him out of seeking up to that point in time, following the direction of the various gurus, he decided to approach the seeking for himself based on his own practical experience and based on addressing it like he would some other problems that he felt equipped to address, and that was by dealing with it very practically. He used to say that being a banker for 40 years meant you had to be practical. You can't deal with situations in the real world and not be pragmatic, not approach the problem by asking yourself, what really is the problem? How are we going to fix this in a way that is practical and not just theoretical? You can't, for example, lend people money based on a theory when in practice it's not delivering outcomes. You need to adjust the practice so that it is practical, so that it works in practice. And I guess having approached life in that way and been trained to look at things practical, he was equipped to come up with this particular framework. And it sort of was inspired by a question he asked his family guru. And based on the answer he got, which he said didn't satisfy him, that was one of the reasons why he said, let me put all of that behind me. And the situation I'm speaking of was he asked a question that he thought was very practical, that thought a seeker should ask this question: what will I have after liberation or enlightenment that I didn't have before? And because he was earnest in his seeking, genuine in his seeking, it wasn't about following protocol, but it was about, what do I need to know? What do I need to look at in order for the seeking to unfold? And so this question seemed like a very relevant, important question to ask, and more importantly, the answer. The only reason to ask the question is to get an answer that would be helpful. So Ramesh was hoping that if he could get some guidance on essentially what one will have after enlightenment, the whole investigation can happen with that in mind, with that being central to what is being looked at. However, the guru that he asked the question of obviously came from a various tradition, where there were protocols, things that you do and don't ask. And that question seemed too straightforward or too pertinent or too direct or maybe even insolent. And when Ramesh asked the question, he said he could see that the guru started to get very angry and was about to express his dissatisfaction, when Ramesh says it seemed to be apparent that he noticed that many other people in the audience were very interested in what the answer to that question would be. And so because other people were interested in that answer, the guru decided not to get angry. And in this case, I'm not talking about Nisargadatta Maharaj, that ended up being Ramesh's guru around this time, or not around the time of asking this question, but around the time of his retirement, when he decided to take on the seeking based on a practical investigation of his own. This was earlier, it was a family guru. And so instead of getting angry, the family guru answered the question in a way that Ramesh said was an answer you give when you're not really giving an answer. And so the answer was, you'll know when you're enlightened. And so to Ramesh, that was a completely inappropriate answer based on the reason he was asking the question. Because he wanted the answer to help him get to enlightenment. And instead the answer was, well, when you get there, you'll know. Now, that's maybe a valid answer in some context, following a certain teaching methodology. It may be valid to disencourage certain thinking because of an assessment that the way we think is tends to have inherent in it some of the problems that the teaching and the journey is actually trying to transcend and overcome. And so giving answers that the mind can digest may actually be a way of keeping a mind that is seeing things incorrectly and making certain assumptions about how things need to be worked out, maybe giving that type of thinking more food. And so it can be valid to not give answers, to try and starve the intellect and get it to break out of its normal groove. However, in the case of Ramesh, who had an intellect that was less prone to making certain critical thinking errors because of his experience, because of the fact essentially he had been trained to bypass various critical thinking errors, it turns out that applying the intellect in Ramesh's case up to a certain point, essentially up to a point where the intellect realized where its limitation was, that, in Ramesh's case, was very valid to take that approach. So, having not got an answer, he decided to let go of any concepts about what liberation or enlightenment was, and making it personal, keeping it practical. He said, what am I really looking for? If I drop the idea of enlightenment as something amazing that we should all strive for or aspire to, something that we might have heard about, that is sometimes described in very appealing ways, like, knowing your own self that has a brightness of 1 billion suns, for example. If we hear that sort of description, then we're going to almost take that description as literal, maybe, and then say, that sounds like something I need. And so Ramesh had said, I've done enough of that. What am I really looking for? And keeping it simple, he said, really, all I want is to have a happy life, to be happy, genuinely happy, where intuitively he knew that wasn't the case. And that wasn't because he didn't have good fortune in terms of his circumstance. In fact, I think we could say that Ramesh experienced much better fortune overall than a lot of other people. He was intelligent, he was successful, he had a loving family, and lived in fairly comfortable circumstances. He was well respected. And yet, intuitively, he knew that that wasn't the happiness that there seemed, because of the fact unhappiness was there in whatever form, it seemed like there was something that was needed. And when he kept it really simple, he said, I just want happiness. But because he didn't have happiness, he came to a conclusion, which is a very important conclusion, and it demonstrates the fact that he was keeping it very practical. He said, I don't know what happiness is. He said, we've been told what happiness is, and we've concluded what happiness is based on our current structure and makeup, and that usually is a belief that happiness is pleasure. That the more pleasure we get, the better our circumstances, then that is what will make us one day potentially happy. He said, what if that's wrong? If I follow the deep intuition that I just want to be happy, and yet I follow an incorrect idea of what happiness for the human being is, then my seeking is essentially going to be moving in the wrong direction. So he decided, given that he couldn't get good answers from the teachings which he had engaged in for many years, it's not that he couldn't get good answers. He's not saying the teachings weren't good enough. It just hadn't delivered up to this point in time. So he said, let me go to my unhappiness. And he suggests this for seekers. Let me look at what my unhappiness is, and that may then give me a hint as to what happiness is. And so he said, I waited for those times where I could put my hand on my heart and say, in this moment, I am not happy. And when that moment is caught, in this moment I'm not happy, then looking at what the unhappiness is in such a way that maybe hasn't been done before, looking at the fine detail, could happen. And what he found is that the unhappiness was essentially an uncomfortableness with himself and with the other based on the pain that the other delivered to him from time to time, and the pain that he inevitably delivered to others from time to time when his actions were not in line with the preferences of the others, and when the others acted in ways that delivered outcomes that were not in line with his preference. And what he found is that those sort of circumstances, the actions of the others that delivered pain to him and his actions that delivered pain to himself or to those that he loved, or even perfect strangers, those situations would create a feeling of uncomfortableness, hatred towards the other. You hurt me, so I hate you. I hurt you, and therefore I hate myself. Or I did something that hurt myself. The outcome wasn't what I had hoped, and therefore, once again, I hate myself. And that is blame and shame. And when he looked at this and said, this is human unhappiness, and then he thought about it, and he said, it's perfectly reasonable to feel this way. How can we not hate and blame the other when they deliver pain to us? And how can we not hate and blame ourselves when we function in a way that delivers outcomes that are not in line with our expectations? So he thought long and hard about this, and at some point he came up with a conclusion. A conclusion that didn't deliver the happiness he was looking for, but at least satisfied his seeking and brought it to an end temporarily. And the conclusion was, if this is human unhappiness, an uncomfortableness with oneself and an uncomfortableness with the other based on how we act and what we do, he said, based on that, given that is a reasonable feeling to have, human happiness is not available in this life. And having come to that conclusion for himself, based on a considered investigation of life, having found out what his unhappiness was, concluding that it's unrealistic to be happy in the face of the pain that the others deliver and be happy in the face of pain that you deliver, that's it. It's not available. Human happiness is not available. And so he was able to put seeking behind him on the firm conclusion, it's pointless seeking happiness because it doesn't make sense that it's available in this life. So remember, because it's very easy for us to hear this word, let's keep it practical. Let's investigate for ourselves and think we know what it means. And so hopefully this story shows an example of that practicality and that investigating for oneself in action, so that we don't remain stuck in the head assuming what certain concepts mean and not investigating for ourselves and not confirming it for ourselves, which is essential in order for the understanding to move from an intellectual understanding, which is just something we've read in a book, because we could easily say, I've read it in a book, I trust the book, I read it in 5 books, they all say more or less the same thing, so that's it. And that's essentially a belief. Once it gets confirmed for ourselves, not necessarily the end outcome, because that might not be available to be confirmed, but we can confirm a lot of the descriptions of life, or at least some of them that are able to be seen. And as we confirm 1, 2, 3, 4 of the descriptions, the explanations of dynamics that maybe hadn't been seen and then become seen, the puzzle starts to unfold. We understand more on a deeper level And that maybe starts to reveal other aspects of life because of the unfolding nature of the puzzle, of our appreciation of the laboratory that we're working in, or the landscape that we're working in. Anyway, going back to the story, because if it ended there, we probably wouldn't have a teaching. We wouldn't have a teaching about happiness for the human being in daily living. So, having put the seeking behind him, he said one day a rather remarkable event happened. He got a message that he said felt like it came from outside. A voice saying, "Ramesh, you are wrong. Happiness for the human being is available. It's your birthright. The basis of your happiness is the basis of every religion. A basis that has been forgotten, overlooked, which is why we've been having religious wars for thousands of years." So it's a bit of a riddle. I'll repeat. Ramesh, you are wrong. Happiness for the human being is available. It is our birthright, or your birthright, human being's birthright. And the basis on which our happiness can exist is the basis of all religions, a basis that has been forgotten, which is why we've been having religious wars for thousands of years. So that message that had a profound sense to it, a message that came from what Ramesh describes as outside, inspired a picking up of the seeking where it was left off. And he said that one day he was thumbing through the Bible, because the hint was it is the basis of all religions. And he said he flicked onto a page and there were the four most beautiful words he had read. "Thy will be done." And when he read those words, he was struck by them in such a way that he felt this is the answer. This is the answer to the riddle. I was given a hint, and in a way, the answer has been presented to me. And when he thought about it, he realized the Hindu religion says the same thing, but in a more profound way. It says, "Thou art the speaker, thou art the listener," implying that everything is God in action. In Islam, one of the key tenets, inshallah, God willing. And now, thanks to fella who is being brought up in Judaism, which I'm not particularly familiar with, and yet she says the same principle is scattered throughout Judaism. And even in some of the mystical, a lot of the mystical spirituality, it's very clear that God's will is a key aspect. So anyway, with this new information, Ramesh had to reassess and said, how does this information change my conclusion? A conclusion that says, if someone hurts me, I have to feel uncomfortable with them. I have to hate them. I have to see them as an enemy or a competitor or someone who is a threat. And if I hurt myself or do something and the outcome is not that great, or do something and hurt someone even if it's not my intention, then how can I just be okay with it? I have to feel uncomfortable with myself. That was the previous conclusion. And then he said, now, but looking at it through this lens, that thy will be done, God's will is being done. All there is God's will. Then assessing a situation where the other delivers pain to us is now seen as destiny unfolding, God's will unfolding, and the other being an instrument through which what is destined to happen happens. An instrument through which God's will is delivered, which really means a means by which my destiny is fulfilled. In that case, destiny is to have pain in the moment. And it is destiny of the other to be the one through which the pain in the moment is delivered. And that applies for pleasure in the moment too. So from this point of view, there isn't a separate other that is hurting me because of their own free will. Something that they have, because of their own volition, their own independence, chosen to act that way and deliver pain to me. And in the same way, an action that happens through me, which previously was seen as my action, is not the action of a separate independent doer, doing something suboptimal and should have been done better, but rather the same, destiny unfolding in order for whatever is destined to happen in each moment to happen. So from this point of view, Ramesh then said that we're all universal brothers and sisters. And when the other is an instrument through which pain is delivered, seeing them as a separate independent entity, the doer, therefore seeing them as a enemy or a rival, a competitor, can fall away. And life then gets lived still more or less as it did before in practice, finding oneself in a situation, facing options, needing to make decisions, but understanding that the decisions, the circumstance, is all part of God's will unfolding, and that we can't make a mistake, in the sense we can choose a decision or an option that leads to an outcome that is not perfect, that may be not in line with our preference, but it's not an ultimate mistake in that that is what happened and therefore what was destined. So we can't make a mistake is not referring to the outcome. Previously, a decision was a right decision or a mistaken decision based on whether it delivered a good outcome or not. With these new eyes, that notion of a personal mistake falls away. And with it falls away the load of guilt and blame and the load of hatred and resentment. Blame towards the other, which in effect is then hatred and resentment towards the other. That burden that has been carried around for a whole lifetime, with a change in perspective, can fall away instantaneously. No more regret about what happened in the past. No more expectation about what needs to happen in the future. This understanding means we are always connected to Source. We understand that we are an expression of Source, that we can't do anything unless it is an expression of source. The speaking is a happening, the thinking is a happening, the feelings are a happening, the behavior is a happening, and they wouldn't happen if source wasn't powering, wasn't enlivening each and every human being. So from this point, or this perspective, we are all being lived. And so there's no need to have expectations of the future, worry about the future, which was a necessity when we believed we were the ones controlling the future. There can be a surrender into the fact that life will carry on. That we can't stop. This understanding that everything is God's will is not going to have us suddenly stop and the story end. What happens is, in each moment we will find ourselves still moving based on the same underlying principle that was moving us before, which was our biological preferences still remain intact, even when our sense of personal doership falls away. And so given a circumstance, the preferences will move in one way or in one direction or another. And that is destiny unfolding, God's will unfolding. Now, it can easily sound like, oh, this is just a belief. Things can't possibly be all happening according to God's will. When we put that aside for a second and we say, look at what your unhappiness is in life, we'll find that unhappiness is the arising, the presence of suffering. Now, suffering is not a word used to describe pain of circumstance. In this explanation, the pain of circumstance is described as pain, and the pleasure of circumstance is described as pleasure. And as we all know, that the flow of life, circumstance, is always going to be sometimes pleasurable and sometimes painful. Sometimes we get what we want, sometimes we don't get what we want. Sometimes we get much more than what we want. That essentially is not in our control. The circumstance is influenced by so many factors outside of our control. And when we look at it, even our actions that are part of the circumstance, then we say, oh, but that is in my control. And when we look at it, our actions are really a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. They're the only two factors that influence the biological and the psychological entity, which is the human being. And that biological entity, the human being, finds itself in a set of circumstances that are very detailed and not as they are because of me. The circumstance of the world when we walk out onto the street, when we walk out into the garden, even into our house, is there because of everything that came before. And so the biological and psychological entity, a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning in that moment, finds itself in an environment, and there is a reaction. There is a series of reactions in the body-mind organism that inspire speech, inspire thoughts, inspire feelings, and inspire action. So even the things that feel like they are my doing, when we investigate them, we find they are based on influences and reactions that are largely or completely interactions and in place. Everything is in place, not because I did it. So when we look at our suffering, we see that it is essentially built on the premise that I am the doer. I am a separate, independent entity. And that's the human condition. The human condition is that we essentially develop with an assumption, a feeling, a conclusion that I am the one that thinks, I am the one that controls my thinking and my speaking and my actions, that there is some part of us that is a controller, a doer. Essentially, that is the opposite of thy will be done. It's the reason why suffering for the human being exists. So if someone is interested in the question of human happiness, then what I'm putting forward is relevant. If someone is saying, oh, look, I'm not really interested in human happiness, I'm interested in business success. Well, this set of explanations may not be particularly relevant to that objective. But remember, if we are interested in happiness for the human being, simple happiness, we're putting aside enlightenment for now. We might find out that happiness and enlightenment are not dissimilar, maybe even the same thing. But let's leave that aside and let's just stick to the fact that really what inspires our seeking is the fact that we're not completely content and at peace or happy in life. And so we might at some point say, who am I kidding? Let me leave enlightenment or all these lofty things to someone else. I just want simple happiness. If that's the case, we need to go through the same process and see that the unhappiness is based on the assumption, I am the doer, and then the feelings of separation. Feelings of separation that arise, that are ultimately a feeling of uncomfortableness with oneself and the other. And even an uncomfortableness with the other is really an uncomfortableness with oneself. Separation, because the very fact that we take ourselves to be insulated, essentially, an independent, insulated entity, a me that makes decisions uninfluenced by anything, a decision that we can claim as mine, my decision, my thoughts, my feelings, my actions. So that view of ourselves as a separate, independent, volitional entity is separation from the other. It's separation from life. We have this psychological idea of who we are as a separate entity that essentially creates a boundary around us. And that psychological idea has the effect of creating the separation. A separation that may not actually exist. And yet, a deeply ingrained idea can be very powerful. So I was going down this track because someone could say, this notion that it's all God's will is fanciful thinking. So, okay, let's put it aside for a sec. Let's look at what the human unhappiness is, and we do see that it is feelings and relationships to life based on an idea of who we are. And that idea of who we are is very fragile. It's an idea of who we are that does have to fear the other, because at any moment they can take what we feel we need away from us. Because if we know ourselves as separate, then that means we really are just a physical entity. There's not much else to fall back onto except being a very vulnerable physical entity in a physical world, where at any moment our demise can come about. And so the different forms of suffering, the guilt and the shame and the insecurity, the sense of not being good enough sets in. It's an idea that I, this separate entity, haven't lived up to the standards, to my parents' standards, society's standards, and most importantly, God's standards. And that is maybe as erroneous as the idea, if it's erroneous, that we are a separate, independent entity. And the blame to the other may be as erroneous as the idea that we and the other is separate entity in control of what they do in each moment, and therefore, they should consider what I like, what I want, and not do anything that will hurt me. So if we maintain the fact that there is no such thing as a happening in life, if we maintain that doesn't exist really, it makes sense for us to conclude, as Ramesh did when his perspective was that way, that human happiness, which happens to equate to what enlightenment in practical terms delivers, which is happiness in its real form, happiness through peace of mind, which is the absence of this attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, the absence of the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation. We will have to acknowledge, if we say, I don't believe that life is an unfolding outside of our control. And so I would encourage someone to not then hold an incompatible expectation for happiness. However, if you find yourself resonating with suggestions of wisdom teachings that we have forgotten ourselves, we have forgotten the nature of life. Life is an illusion and some of the important aspects have been covered up. That life is a play of consciousness, and not only a play of consciousness, but it's described as Maya, the illusion in which misunderstanding, ignorance sets in. And those same teachings are telling us that a remembering of our true nature, a seeing life truly, a union with Source, a coming to know ourselves, a remembering of who we are, is a mystical and fundamentally available and necessary shift in order for something quite remarkably different to set into place. And when we interpret those descriptions that I've just put forward, we start to realize that seeing life truly, illusion falling away, may talk about seeing life as a oneness creation, unfolding in each moment exactly as it's destined to unfold. Ramana, which is a voice that most people resonate deeply with, one of the key pillars that he put forward is summed up in this statement he made. I'll paraphrase. Everything happens according to the great ordainer. The body moves according to the body's parabrahma, the body's karma. It is driven by the body's karma, which is really saying that in these two lines, the first line says everything that happens according to the great ordainer. And then it says the body moves according to the body's karma, which really is saying the great ordainer has put in place the karma in order for the body to move exactly as it is destined. It goes on to say, whatever is destined to happen in the universe will happen regardless of what forces try to make it not happen. And whatever is destined not to happen in the universe will not happen, no matter what forces try to make it happen. With this understanding, the only course of action is silence. But that last, the previous statements are self-explanatory about what will and won't happen according to destiny. Exactly what is destined will happen, regardless of what other forces in the universe try to affect that. And whatever forces are trying to affect it also is destiny unfolding. But the ultimate outcome will be according to the destined outcome. So when this is understood, meaning when life is seen this way, the only course of action is to remain silent. It means there's nothing to say. There's no capacity for us to look back on the past and regret. And that's the non-silence of the ongoing thinking mind that doesn't ever feel satisfied with the past. It's hanging on to the past, essentially saying, oh, if only I had done this differently, if only the other had done this, why is my life turning out like this? All of that narrative is the opposite of silence. And it makes sense that that will be there if life is being seen as what I made happen and that I could have acted differently, I should have acted differently. And so this hypothetical regression back into the past or holding on to the past with regret is bound to be there. And the same with looking into the future, with expectations, having ideas of how life should unfold, how we want it to unfold. But if we understand everything is happening according to the great ordainer, source, destiny, then a lot of that thinking is seen as futile. It will turn out as it's going to turn out, and I will function in the moment practically according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I find myself in. So life becomes very simple. How do I live my life, Ramesh used to say, is a valid question with the understanding that everything is completely predetermined. He said, that's fine. The answer is simple. In each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do. Because the thoughts that you have about what you think or feel to do is what is destined. And whether they get enacted or not will happen according to destiny. So you can't make a mistake. So you might as well live life doing what you think or feel to do, which is how we all have always lived our life. Even if we are plagued with fear, the fear might be arising and influencing what we think or feel to do. And yet we are still doing what we think or feel to do, given our particular makeup, which may include a whole lot of fear about the future. If that fear falls away, we will still, in the moment, be doing what we think or feel like doing, but what we think or feel like will be inspired by different components, different arisings, different ways of processing the importance of outcomes and regardless of whether we are functioning from doership and fear or from a place free of doership and attachment to outcomes, it is all God's will. So you can't make a mistake. And the practical benefit of this is that the suffering falls away. That there is a freedom from suffering. And when that sets in, then we start having our own experience of the peace that comes with the end of suffering. And if we acknowledge circumstance is not something that we control, that even if we get pleasure because of a certain circumstance, or if we get a certain success, that's not some magic pill that means, okay, now anything that goes wrong in the future, it's okay because I had that success 10 years ago. So at some point we realize, no, circumstance, pleasure, is either pleasurable or painful, and there's no debate that pleasure is on a biological level more preferable than pain. So we're not saying that whether it's pleasure or pain is irrelevant and indifferent. It's irrelevant and indifferent to my happiness. To my pleasure or pain, it is. But we'll leave that up to life. But with a certain attitude, the circumstance doesn't get in, we don't get involved in the circumstance as if that is my happiness. And when that starts to be experienced, we realize that must be the only happiness that is available in life. Because a happiness from circumstance means that we would need life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. And even that is a happiness on the assumption that continuous pleasure will give happiness. And what those people in life that find themselves in a fortunate position to be able to buy all sorts of pleasures, they'll tell you that that doesn't deliver happiness, because the happiness, and more importantly the unhappiness, is on a different dimension. It's on the psychological sense of self. And that attitude that looks out and sees oneself as a separate entity, a doer disconnected from source, in fact not even recognizing or considering the fact that there is a source, that all of this comes from source, that psychological identity is inherently uncomfortable. Contained within that structure is uncomfortableness. So regardless of how much pleasure is delivered, there will be an inherent uncomfortableness pervading the circumstance. And when that falls away, it's like, this is all I was ever really looking for. Meaning, this is all that can ever really satisfy the absence of resistance, the absence of the psychological sense things are not good enough. So they don't become good enough. The relationship that says they are not good enough falls away. And in the absence of a feeling that arises that says, this is an attack on who I am, the way you acted, the way I acted is an attack on who I am, when that can't arise because the entity from which it used to arise has dissolved, then we find by default, which is not at all how our brain thinks it is possible, we find in the absence of the feeling and the thought it is not good enough, the very same circumstance is felt to be perfect, we could say. Not circumstantially perfect, but as it's meant to be, and not an attack of who I am at my core. So in rounding this off, Ramesh used to describe peace of mind, which is the happiness for the human being, which is the absence of suffering, the non-arising of suffering, the end of suffering. And incidentally, the Buddha, when asked to describe enlightenment, made it very simple. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. He didn't say enlightenment is ananda, or bliss. Enlightenment is X, Y, and Z. Very simple, put it in its negative form, and addressed gave the answer that is on the practical level. The end of suffering. So after putting forward the very practical explanation and description, which matches the Buddha's, Ramesh would say, happiness for the human being is continuous unbroken peace of mind. Continuous unbroken peace of mind is simply the non-arising of suffering that disturbs our natural state of peace of mind. And that is the same as and arises when there is an understanding of non-doership. And the understanding of non-doership is really just the dissolution of the deeply ingrained belief of doership. And that can be called continuous and unbroken connection to Source. So happiness is an outcome of our continuous unbroken connection to Source. Peace of mind is a result of our continuous unbroken connection to Source. The understanding of non-doership results in the continuous unbroken connection to Source. And why that is the case is because in order for peace of mind to be there, the understanding of non-doership, which means everything is happening according to Source, everything is happening according to the Great Ordainer, and everything is a creation of Source. Source has turned into the 8 billion human beings and the mountains and rivers and oceans. And therefore we are inherently Source, being lived by the power of Source moving through us. And that means we are always by default connected to Source. And even when we believe we are the doer, our connection to Source when we are the doer is still intact, because the belief in doership doesn't suddenly bring in a doer. In the belief, when there is the belief of doership, which is the human condition, that is a belief put in place by Source, and still each human instrument is being lived by Source in order for the story of life to be the story of life it is. Meaning wars and cruelty as well as kindness and celebration. So we never have been a doer. No one has ever done anything. Everyone has always and always will be being lived. But when the belief in personal doership is there is an effective breaking of that connection to Source. Not that it's actually broken, but the recognition of it is broken. And so when there is no belief in personal doership, it means the recognition of our being lived is there in an unbroken sense. So some follow-on concepts that can help us maybe bump into that which is being overlooked and is the closest we can come to know Source. One is a summation of non-duality from the top-down perspective in a very concise way. And that is the suggestion that consciousness or Source at rest. Now, Source at rest, consciousness at rest. Remember, consciousness is essentially synonymous with mind, And what mind does is mind imagines. It has this power to think into existence. Now we're used to human thinking as essentially language, but imagine the consciousness, the universal consciousness creates through imagination. We could call it thought, but it's not the movement of language. So a dream at night is a mirrored down example of what is meant by creation of thought in consciousness and imagination in consciousness. So consciousness imagines into existence a world, a universe, a manifestation. But prior to that, that consciousness, which we can call infinite creative potentiality because at rest it is like a bubbling potential that hasn't at that point actualized. It's source or God at rest, not even aware of itself. Absolute nothing, the unmanifest. And because it's potential creativity, at some point it has to actualize. Otherwise it would be dead, not potential. And so it actualizes at some point, and its nature is creative, manifesting potential creativity. So it doesn't have to premeditate what it will turn into. It just manifests into whatever it manifests, and whatever it manifests will be a creative masterpiece. And so Advaita Vedanta, non-duality, is saying everything is Brahman, God. There is nothing outside of God. The whole universe is inside of God. And so I'm suggesting that what it's talking about is God as universal consciousness. Essentially we can say the mind of God, or God is mind, universal mind, that explodes into movement, which means the manifestation comes into existence. And one very useful way of looking at it is comes into existence as a block. And that block that has been created, that masterpiece, includes all of time and space in it. So time and space has come into existence as part of the manifest. And you and I are characters in the timeline of the manifest. We are part of the manifestation. So God has become you and I, and everything that has happened in time and history. And as a block, all that is known is the present moment. So the present moment is seeing each slice of the block one moment at a time. And so from our point of view, source is knowing itself, knowing the manifestation, not from out there looking in through CCTV, or in a way it is CCTV. We are the instrument, we are the camera. And so I, for a long time in my seeking, was imagining source, aware, witnessing, and not clicking that what I am, the consciousness functioning through Roger, is the consciousness of source functioning through a particular body-mind instrument, aware of the manifestation it has become. And that same source is functioning through each of the instruments that it has created, the 8 billion of them, plus all the animals, experiencing the manifestation from those perspectives. So what I used to feel as my personal human, separate from God experience, wondering when I would find and have union with God, which is a conceptual idea that created a psychological, conceptual separation between something that is closer than close, and is the same for everyone. It is so close for everyone. Not even close doesn't even isn't the right word, because it suggests very little distance. The truth is there's no distance between what we are and the God that is pointed at. God, source, consciousness is functioning through you and I. And so that is where we get to know source, by coming back and resting in our own being. That is our connection to source. That is where we know that source and I are not two. That's where we come to know that God's will and Roger's will are two ways of expressing the same thing. What I feel like doing in each moment, what I pick out of the fridge, what I say is, in practical terms, my will, or at least feels like it manifests as what Roger would like. And that's a gift, the feeling of free will. And when this merging happens, then we realize that God's will functions through all of us as what appears to be my will in the moment. So my will and God's will are not two. This hopefully doesn't just remain as fanciful concepts and stories in your head, but attention can come to right here, the present moment, not necessarily considering the universe or the manifest as the theoretical universe that science explains, which is hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of light years this way and that way, and out there. If we run with a conceptual notion of the universe as being out there, we're never really going to bump into it, because that idea keeps us separate from a part of the universe. So I suggest that we treat the manifestation and the universe as that which is here for each of us. We change our notion of the universe as being very big to being as big as exists in your present moment experience. So if you're at the top of a mountain looking out, the present moment experience is about as big as it's going to get for us, unless you happen to go for a ride up in a spaceship, maybe in an aeroplane. You look out and you realize that is the present moment experience. If you're in a room, the present moment experience, as it presents in practice, is that big. And that is here and now. That is the manifestation when we keep it practical. When we drop the idea, the concept we have of the universe, concept based on past experience, how we remember it, when we say, oh, well, but if I walk outside, there's more of the universe. Well, at the moment, you're not walking outside. When you walk outside, then say that is the universe, and then you'll realize, oh, now the room isn't there anymore. This, not so that we live that way, because in that case we'd never go to the shops, because we would say there is no such thing as a shop, there's just this. So it's not to live that way in totality, but if we're trying to bump into the present, the presence that is here now, the presence that is here now is what our universe arises in. I promise you, just a little shift like that, if that little shift doesn't happen and we keep contemplating the universe as something out there, an awakening to the simple consciousness that is the core of each human being can remain a mystery. So the next intensive, which I think is in 3 or 4 weeks' time at the end of August, is witnessing and abiding in I Am, which focuses much more on coming back to that which is not the biological or the psychological, finding our home that is the ground of our own being. So I'll open it up to some questions. Hello, Hiroko. We seem to be having some sound problems. You maybe have to yourself. Oh, that doesn't seem to be working. Okay. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Roger. Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for this morning's talk. It really, it's just it's all what I want to hear, but without searching for it. So there was no expectations when I tuned in today, and I was just something that just happened, right? And when you look back on the point that Ramesh used to make, and now you're doing, and now you're saying how it is God's will, and what's that will, and that will is, it's God's will. And in fact, do you remember once Ramesh saying, not only is it God's will or thy will be done, he had once even pointed out and said, thy will has been done. Do you remember that? Or in one of his talks? So it's just a huge reminder, of all the things that occur in everyone's life. And just recently I had an exchange with, I had an exchange with someone who, tries hard to get back to that place. And it's always a good one line that if one grasps the true meaning of it, they really, cannot be moved around by any pleasure or pain,
Yeah, the trick...
I do think that, yeah.
Well, the trick is to really grasp it beyond it being some sort of application in a way, like you're pointing at. It needs to go really deep, where it's not just some, religious mantra.
Or mental, or just mental, because I feel like the more I mature and live life, pleasure and pain are equal in this heart. It's taken as an equal opportunity to feel the way going to be felt.
Mm-hmm.
So today's talk was just wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for commenting.
Nice.
Yeah, also the point you make.
Yeah.
Let's not mistake "Thy will be done" as in something in the future. It's very important. Is what it's saying is, God's will is being done in each moment. Has always been being done.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is also another pointer of it being so important to realize how this is what we have. Right now is what we have. But every moment, as said, in a way you said it was really nice, a block of the past, a block of the future, but the blocks of each moment is what really matters. And because we can't go back. And if we want to move forward, we just don't know what will happen.
Yeah.
We can have goals and expectations, so to speak, but if we truly live in that moment, I think that's when it becomes more worthwhile either way. So,
Completely.
yeah, it's really nice to hear this from someone.
Great. Well, I'm glad I'm the instrument in delivering it for now. So.
Oh, yeah, you're right, and it's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, Layla.
Hi, Roger. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. It's always good to see you, Roger.
Thank you. Nice to hear from you.
Thank you. My question is, I'm listening to you for a long time, and I am in this road for many, many years, but still I see I am in play of Leela. Still I see things happen, I react, if somebody yells at me or I get mad, or I am too much into play of Leela.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see any, theoretically I understand, but when it comes to experience, day by day, moment by moment, if somebody, cross me on the way when I drive, and, is any end to it, or I have to just listen to you and one day kicks in? Do you know what I mean?
Well, it will kick in if it's destined. If not, it won't kick in. That's the whole point, right? Life is unfolding in each moment exactly as it's destined. So one thing, rather than wanting your involvement to come to an end, because we might realize that is futile. It will come to an end when it comes to an end. So when you see the involvement, maybe you can laugh at it at the same time and say, this is destiny. It is destiny for me to get involved with what is happening. And that attitude towards your involvement is the attitude of non-doership. So sometimes we're very focused on changing the primary involvement, thinking that's what I need to change, and what that can do, it means that there is maybe an attitude of doership to the primary involvement that says, this shouldn't be there, I'm not doing it right, why am I not getting it? And so if that attitude towards the primary involvement changes, where we laugh at it and go, there's God's will again, right? God's will is for me to get very frustrated by their actions, to shout at them as if they're the doer, to feel that they're the doer. And if a part of us comes in and goes, God's will in action, that part that says that is the understanding of non-doership. And from there, that understanding can filter inwards. But if it doesn't start on the outside, and we're so focused on the primary suffering, saying this needs to change, then even on the outside there is doership. So It starts from the outside and works its way in.
Yeah, the doership is very strong feeling. Because that's what I learned from childhood, that I'm the doer. It's so hard to undo it.
It's impossible because there is no doer.
It's impossible.
It's God's will.
Yes.
When it happens.
Yes. Yes. It's very beautifully you said. I will do that the next time when something arises.
Let's hope, because that too is God's will. So
that's true.
We have to, that's it. It's like a surrender. Oh, it will happen. Everything will happen according to God's will. So yes, as you said, the doership, if you can feel it as very strong, then that's a good assessment. You can even say, yes, the doership is very strong. Why? Because that is what is destined. And that itself, that recognition itself is more understanding of non-doership. It's more understanding it's God's will. So it's not so much about even it needing to change. It's just about this attitude coming in and going, whatever is here is God's will, and whatever happens in the future is God's will. And it makes sense that maybe because we have this discussion, that will arise in tomorrow or the day after. But if it doesn't, then we say, okay, it's not destined just yet.
Yes. Thank you so much. And one more question, because I wasn't here. Your intensive satsang, how we can register for end of the...
On the website, under the events section, there is a registration section.
Okay.
So that would be very good.
Okay, thank you so much, Roger. I really appreciate your talks. Thank you.
Yes, you're very welcome.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Hello, come on, Lak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Okay, great. It's actually Hiroko, and I had to get another account. But I wanted to, thank you, first of all, for your teaching. I guess not really a question, but I want to tell you a story about around 2 days ago. I woke up with a really vivid, intense reaction to a dream. I was like shaking and in anger, and in the dream, like it was the anger that I had towards the person was really irrational. I could see that, and in the moment, I knew that it was part of the unfolding, and I was not part of it, and I could see how irrational it was. But regardless of whatever, I felt an enormous resistance to it. So I don't know if it's worth even asking for a practical response to that when your body you're actually, there's adrenaline and you're shaking of anger. And usually I let it go, and it doesn't happen for a few months. And then it does, these intense bursts of emotion pops up. So it almost feels like I shouldn't let this opportunity go to perhaps, I don't know, like explore further. I would love to hear what you say about that.
Yeah, well, the overriding attitude is to see anger arising in a body-mind organism, to see thoughts arising in a body-mind organism. And so when anger and in particular arises in an intense way, you can sort of feel it come in like a flood of energy overriding you. And so the seeing of it as not your doing, but a happening because circumstances a particular way, and in that moment the body-mind organism with its particular structure in that way and the circumstance results in this emotion arising. And the standard everyday way of looking at it is, I got angry, right? I got very angry. And that
Yeah.
that relationship to it is, I got angry, is that was something that belonged to Hiroko or to Roger. It was my anger, it was what I am. And so this subtle shift, which is to see anger arising in a body-mind organism, what sees the anger arise in the body-mind organism is subtly outside or looking in, witnessing that happen. It helps create a bit of a distance. And so it's not necessarily about only applying that to the anger when it's intense, but rather developing a practice that isn't a practice that you control, but rather because of maybe this new conditioning, this way of answering your question, you start to see, if you stub your toe, there can be the awareness of the pain as pain arising in a body-mind organism, rather as opposed to my pain. I kicked the chair, and then I was in pain. Now we're actually saying, oh, that is pain arising in a body-mind organism, and you can't force it. It's not a practice that you have to take on like a mantra that you do 10 times a day at this hour. But if it starts being a curious witnessing of all of these movements of the body that we previously said was my doing, and we start finding this relationship to, oh, that is a thought arising, an emotion arising, a feeling of hunger, let's say, arising, or even the attitude of doership can be seen as a thought or a feeling, an attitude arising in a particular body-mind organism in a particular moment. And then it fades away to be replaced by something else arising in a body-mind organism.